When I started playing Magic, my friend Nick just watched me build a thoroughly unimpressive Vampires deck. And on one fatal lunch break, he played a game against me and just took me out on turn 3. He did dozens of game actions that just flew right over my head. And I asked him if this was the best deck in Magic, and he answered, I don't know. I can't play this deck anywhere. Half the cards are banned. Sometimes it doesn't matter how many heads you cut off, you'll only eventually be able to kill the Hydra with fire. Could we move on to the banning of Mox Opal?
Yeah, preferably not, but not yet.
There is no other game quite like Magic the Gathering. Don't even try. It was an unexpected success, transcending into popular culture and inspired a whole generation of games. This is a photo of a Pokemon TCG tournament. Now a Yu-Gi-Oh! YCS with 6,000 players. And this is MagicCon Vegas. These rooms would be empty if Richard Garfield, the creator of Magic, hadn't set out to solve a game design issue called the Queen problem. If you make a game, like Magic, where people decide what pieces they play, why would they ever play pawns? They're like the Magikarp of chess. If you had a chessboard and could place any combination of pieces to accompany your king, you'd be a big ol' liar if you said you wouldn't just slam 15 queens onto that board. And no one wants to play that game. Richard found 3 solutions to that problem, and they megazorded into what we now know as the game of Magic. Solution number 1, create a resource system. In Magic, you have lands. You can play one a turn, and every turn you can tap them to produce 1 mana, which is like a coin that you can trade in on that turn to pay for a card. If your queen costs 5 coins, but was the most powerful piece in the game, and the pawn cost only 1 coin, your opponent would have played 10 to 15 pawns by the time you can play a queen. And we all remember that episode of the French Revolution. Solution number 2, make the game collectible. If pawns and bishops were easy to find, and you maybe had traded yourself a few towers and a knight, then the power disparity of the queen isn't as bad if you don't see it in every game.
Richard did talk about, well, look, this system breaks down a little bit if the game's wildly successful, but hey, if the game's wildly successful, we can solve it then.
That was Mark Rosewater, the head designer for Magic the Gathering and my nominee for Person in the World Who Has the Most Fun at the Office on his podcast Drive to Work. He's particularly relevant when it comes to Richard's 3rd solution to the queen problem because he is one of its biggest champions. Solution number 3, the color pie.
The color pie exists for a very important reason. Before Richard made Magic, he made a game called The 5 Colors. So when Richard came up with the idea of a trading card game, he didn't make a game from scratch. What he did was he took a game he had made for some other purpose and repurposed it. That game was called 5 Colors. It was based on a book I think he read. The 5 Colors of Magic were part of that game.
And they're an award-winning piece of game design that is just so naturally intuitive. Split the game pieces in 5. If your lands can never produce all 5 types of color resources to always play all your cards, then you'll have to only play cards from 1 to 3 different colors, sacrificing consistency for every color you add.
And the way the mana system and the color pie work is they put pressures in different directions. The mana system makes you want to play less colors, and the color pie makes you want to play more colors. And that tension does a lot of good for the game.
But this video is not about the 3 rules that made the game of Magic, it's about the 1 type of game piece that broke it. The simple artifact.
Players basically knew it was beat Affinity, play Affinity, or lose to Affinity.
Sure.
Those are really your only options.
Another Vial, a Worker, a Frogmite, and a Mirror Enforcer.
Here's my hand.
Hello. The explosive Affinity start that everybody talks about.
This is the draw.
And I'll tell you all about the artifact in Magic the Gathering and how it brought one of Magic's most feared archetypes, Affinity, a deck so powerful it almost made people stop playing Magic entirely on numerous occasions. But first, if you have your hand on the mouse already, you do us a huge favor by just clicking subscribe. These videos take an immense amount of time and research and are hard to justify against making top 5 videos or anything simple, and I desperately need a justification to make more of these. But if you're already subscribed, I thank you from the bottom of my heart. Let's say this is the first time you hear about the game of Magic. Your wallet is strangely heavy and your answer to do you pay the 1 is, who is the 1? So artifacts
are permanents that can represent animated constructs or some kind of magical items or pieces of equipment that are unique in Magic because they're the only types of cards that only feature generic mana in their mana cost, meaning that you can just cast them with any color of mana.
Yep, that was the one and only Frank Karsten. I can't make a video about affinity for artifacts without calling up the man who has an affinity for artifacts. He's a
member of the Pro Tour Hall of Fame, and I've competed in nearly 80 Pro Tours in my life.
I can't imagine anyone else I'm going to go to talk about affinity.
Ever since it was introduced with Mirrored in Block in 2004, I've played it in Block Constructed, Standard, Extended, Legacy, Modern, often to solid tournament results with like a pretty big influence on the development of the archetype. You know, all these affinity cards have brought me a lot of success over the years.
For reasons of game flavor more than play design, Richard Garfield made all of the artifacts colorless, meaning you as a player could use any combination of colored lands to tap for them and their effects.
The idea being behind it is that artifacts were magical items and that any mage could make use of the magical item.
But early artifacts back then were more like the awkward teenager version of what they are now. For example, there was 3 types of artifacts: mono, poly, and continuous. Mono artifacts could be used once a turn, and it was implied that activating them would tap them. Notice how the old Glasses of Urza doesn't have a tap symbol on it, making it somehow even more annoying than it already is? They later fixed this by adding tap symbols to the card. Poly artifacts did not require any tapping, and could be used as many times per turn as you wanted. And continuous artifacts would function as enchantments. Their ability would always be passively on, except when they were tapped, but they couldn't tap themselves. And this is how early Magic became kind of hard to explain to your friends without them thinking you were making up the rules, because most of the time they would just function as is, but some players could get cheeky, like with Icy Manipulator.
Like, first of all, it's just a very good effect, like the ability to tap any permanent. It's a removal for the biggest threat on the board.
That's Tobi, our editor-in-chief of Insight and a resourceful institutional memory of the game. He's telling us about how you could sometimes use Icy Manipulator to do things that kind of felt like cheating.
Its big pull, however, was its interaction with various artifacts like Winter Orb, which wasn't active if it was tapped. So if you have Winter Orb in play, every player only gets to untap 1 land during their turn. But if you also have Icy Manipulator, you can tap the Winter Orb at the end of your opponent's turn. Then during your untap, it will be inactive, meaning you get to untap all of your lands. And then it is untapped again, so obviously when it's your opponent's turn, they again only get to untap 1.
Yuck. Now this already sounds kind of absurd, but artifacts also broke the rule of the color pie. See, each color had its own identity and strict rules on what it could and could not do. Blue, for example, is supposed to be the only color that can counter spells. But if an artifact can counter spells, then all colors can counter spells.
And that's exactly the thing about colorless cards, that anyone can use them, which completely obfuscates the color pie, where different colors are supposed to be good at different things. And one of the biggest offenders here was probably Nevinyrral's Disc.
This card is a 4-mana artifact that enters tapped, and if you pay 1, you destroy all creatures, enchantments, and artifacts.
Blue had an inherent weakness, and Nevinyrral's Disc answered the inherent weakness. Like, one of Blue's problems was, well, what if your opponent just gets a lot of things out fast, faster than you can counter them?
I think it's almost time to try to blow the disc.
And then Blue doesn't have good answers, or at the time did not have good answers for any sort of mass thing. But, while Blue did not have answers, Nevinyrral's Disc and Artifact did. And so Nevinyrral's Disc saw a lot of play.
And early Magic designers had a lot of trouble calibrating artifacts, because they were more in there for their mouthfeel than their actual purpose in the game. Like how phone cameras make a sound when they take a photo. And they don't need to. The first time they made what scientists call an oopsie with artifacts was during Urza Block. The whole set was themed around the multiverse's most powerful artificer. The whole trio of sets was named after him. This man would have absolutely killed it at LEGO. What he did not do so well in is promoting a healthy game environment.
Like, there was first the famous Tolarian Academy deck, then there was Memory Jar, there were a bunch of bannings. More than, I think, 20 cards or so landed on various ban lists across formats.
But that was just Artifacts Shrek 1. It was culturally relevant and surprisingly strong. But the upcoming Mirrodin block would be its Shrek 2, the true moment it found its classic characters. But people often forget about its artifact beatdown ancestor, which for some reason, despite anything their parents taught them, people decided to call Teletubbies.
It was a vintage deck that used Mishra's Workshop to power out a Juggernaut or a Sushi on turn 1.
Before you roll your eyes, remember that creatures did not have 15 keywords back then. Juggernaut, a simple 5/3 with laughable abilities, was once banned for power level.
For the standards of Vintage at the time, it was kind of an aggro control beatdown deck. It also played like blue cards and countered, but its defining feature was this turn 1 4-mana creature.
And people at the time facing down an early Juggernaut had no idea the pain they would be in a few years later when Mirrodin brought in a keyword we're all familiar with today. Just a little thing called Affinity for Artifacts.
The story of Affinity begins with the release of Mirrodin on October 2, 2003.
Which debuted the Affinity for Artifacts mechanic.
And I said, okay, if we're going to do an artifact set, let's make an artifact world. And I think I originally called it Metal World was my name for it.
Metal World is, all silliness aside, a pretty lovely sounding theme park. Now, Mr. Rosewater wanted artifacts to matter in Metal World, so he made a mechanic that would reward you for having a bunch of artifacts on the board.
The Affinity mechanic reduced the cost of spells by 1 colorless mana for each permanent of a particular type you controlled, and Affinity for Artifacts was the most prominent application.
The more artifacts, the better. We really wanted you to just play. There are a lot of artifacts in the set. We wanted you to play a deck full of artifacts, was kind of the flavor.
It first doesn't seem like it should break things too much, right? If you play an artifact land and then another artifact land, on turn 2, your Frogmite is a grizzly bear. And you don't see YouTubers out there making videos about how grizzly bears was WotC's biggest mistake. But once you put the cards in the hands of pro Magic players...
To players who drafted the set, the power of the artifact lands and the potential for the cost reduction mechanic was immediately obvious. In a deck with a lot of affinity cards, each artifact land effectively taps for 2 mana when casting your spells, allowing you to just dump your hand onto the table as early as turn 2 or turn 3.
But stop the eerie music, because this is not the scary affinity deck that you've heard of yet. I said stop it.
The very first Affinity lists with just Mirrodin weren't even like super aggressive or anything.
Truth be told, many of the cards that made the deck so explosive will be in Chapter 2.
The first Pro Tour held after the release of Mirrodin, which was Pro Tour New Orleans in the extended format, was already dominated by Seed of the Synod, but it was typically in decks that exploited it with Tinker.
And it was basically a control deck that used Thoughtcast and Thirst for Knowledge to draw cards.
And then it would close out the game with a Broodstar, which would munch on the opponent while wearing some nice boots, like...
Even Lightning Greaves to protect your Broodstar and give it haste.
And the deck ran counter spells and removal.
Yes, it actually only had like either Spellbomb and Pirate Spellbomb. Artifact.
So... control. But Wizards of the Coast had big plans for artifacts. Well, we're about to enter a year where all the best cards could be played by everyone.
And it kind of broke stuff.
Several months after Mirrodin, Darksteel released,
which completely changed the nature of the Affinity deck.
That set introduced Arcbound Ravager and Skullclamp, which truly supercharged the Affinity deck.
Suddenly it became super aggressive.
You think dentists and clowns are scary? This little spider boy.
A single Arcbound Ravager on the board meant that every artifact creature could become a lethal threat.
You could sacrifice any amount of artifacts to make the Arcbound Ravager fatal, but if they blocked your Ravager, you could just move all of those counters onto any other creature.
He eats the Ether Vial for 0, putting a 3rd counter on the Arcbound Ravager.
And then puts those in the Frogmite.
Then all 3 counters go on the Frogmite, so he's got a pair of 5/5s.
If you had even one Disciple of the Vault on the board, that turn sequence would usually end the game on the spot.
Disciple, how many artifacts are there? There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Yeah,
6 artifacts.
All right, yeah, he's dead if he doesn't cast Arc. He's dead, period, actually.
Turn 3 or 4 kills were not only possible, they were common.
But it wasn't the only broken card in Darksteel. Ravager was actually pretty inexpensive at first because...
a lot of people didn't quite realize how powerful this would end up being.
And it would eventually become nightmare fuel, but the first piece of cardboard to keep players up at night was Skullclamp.
Skullclamp was just one of the most busted cards ever.
Just listening to players coming into the weekend, Skullclamp this, Skullclamp that, it was all about the Skullclamp.
It was just a cheap piece of equipment that you could slap onto one of your grunts for the low cost of 1 mana. It would give them more power, but it would make them easier to kill. And to make your opponent less willing to block it, if your creature died, you would draw 2 cards. Brief spoiler alert, this card is now super illegal.
It ended up being a development mistake.
The card was originally printed like this, and it was garbage. People weren't even putting it in their sealed decks. It cost a whole 5 mana before you can get it on a creature, and then you somehow had to get it to die before you drew cards? So they tried throwing on a small buff, but come on. I'd rather eat this piece of cardboard than have to play it. And Sack Sweater just sounds like something Kanye West would wear. So it sat around in development bulk for a few months until they decided to push some of the new equipments so that they would see play in the standard environment. They had a meeting where they changed the dials on a lot of the cards and left notes of which ones should be tested before going into print. But they did not test Thought Extractor, they just changed the name. And it's partially because the card is hard to evaluate, but mostly because it had been seared into their brains as a terrible card for so many months.
You would just pay 1 mana to kill a creature of your own, allowing you to draw 2 cards, which gave basically an unstoppable refueling power, because you were drawing so many cards with Skullclamp. Assembling game-winning combos like Disciple of the Vault plus Arcbound Ravager was extremely easy.
This unlocked this whole world where it was suddenly all about shrapnel blasts and Disciple of the Vault and dealing 20 damage as fast as possible.
Meanwhile, he's got a Disciple of the Vault and a Welding Jar here in game 1.
Disciple is probably the scariest card in the Affinity deck.
Magic was just a different game now. Most matches would end with someone with their hand on their head doing a bunch of math and taking 37 game actions that would somehow get your life total from 20 to 0 in about as much time as it takes to make popcorn. But you wouldn't even get any popcorn, and if you weren't playing the Affinity deck, you were playing specifically anti-Affinity decks.
At the time, Standard devolved into this game of superpowered artifacts against artifact hate.
Those are really your only options. I believe 40% of the field was made up of some form of
45%.
45%.
110 out of 239.
Which is an absurd percentage for a Pro Tour.
Yeah, I'm not sure we've ever had that before. Had
I don't believe it's been even really close to that.
But you don't go out into a rainstorm without an umbrella, so...
The other 54% of the field was running huge piles of artifact-destroying hate cards, designed to crush Affinity.
People came to the tournament with cards like Detonate, Echoing Ruin, Shatter, Oxidize, Viridian Shaman.
And I have to repeat, these were all in the main deck, so this was just a wild tournament. Everyone was either playing Affinity or gunning for Affinity.
And normally you would look at this kind of metagame and think, this is not what Urza would have wanted. Wait, but the powers that be had their eyes on the final results and saw that only 2 Affinity decks made it past all the hate, played in the top 8 by Ben Stark and Jelger Wigelsma. So it's fine, right? But the deck had not yet been perfected. There was a camp that was not playing Chrome Moxes, then there was Tobi's gang who was, but they were missing out on another, let's say, important card.
A group of us flew to Kobe for the Pro Tour in 2004. And we ran an Affinity deck, but didn't include Arcbound Worker on Arcbound Ravager, which was quite the oversight. So after the Pro Tour, we reworked our Chromox Affinity deck.
An arms race began for who would build the optimal Affinity list, and after a series of nationals, people finally sleeved up what they believed to be the 75 card combination that would win them Grand Prix Brussels.
And at that tournament, the field was dominated by decks that were exploiting Skullclamp, most notably Goblins and Affinity.
Now, there were 2 different factions of Affinity. There were the traditional high artifact count players, and then there was Tobi and his team who played Chrome Mox.
Tobi had some innovation by incorporating more colored cards along with Chrome Mox for even more explosiveness.
For context, that's this Tobi, who seems completely shook that other players had not figured out how good Moxes were.
No one picked up on, because the conventional wisdom at the time was that you can't make, with the necessity to run all of these new artifact creatures from Darksteel, you can't run Chrome Mox anymore. That would be madness.
But Magic players who know how to wind a cassette tape will also know how powerful a Mox is in Magic. It can fool new players into thinking it's just a land, but...
The addition of Chrome Mox to the deck gave more explosiveness, effectively adding, well, literal Mox to the deck. That well, we all know that Moxen are powerful, but when they also enable you to reduce the cost of Frogmite and Mirror Enforcer, or grow your Arcbound Ravager when you have no need for their mana anymore, obviously they are a powerful addition to the strategy.
So players from all across Europe flocked to Grand Prix Brussels with their eyes on the cash prize, along with a deck box containing either ways to beat Affinity or Affinity itself.
The finals of that Grand Prix was an Affinity Mirror between Kai Bude and Tobi Henke.
And we simply can't skip over that name. Kai Bude, the German juggernaut, was the Michael Jordan of Magic at the time. Often referred to as the greatest of all time, Kai had preceded this finals at Grand Prix Brussels with 9 Grand Prix wins, 6 Pro Tour victories, 2 World Championship titles, and his literal face on a Magic card. And that was just his wins, because we simply don't have time in this video for all of his top 8s.
I mean, he's been the best player in the game for ages. He has the best results. He was just top 8ing in every single Pro Tour and not losing when he was in top 8.
So Tobi sat across from this unstoppable land tapping and spell casting machine.
And how did your tournament go?
Well, I brought a prop here.
What does this say? Winner?
It does say winner, yes.
It's not too often you see the German juggernaut on the receiving end of a real kicking, but Tobi's triple Frogmite draw in the finals got him the trophy.
But people had had enough. The Mirrodin block was breaking records for players leaving the game. You didn't have as many ways to play Magic back then, and if every tournament you went to was just ruled by the same dozens of cards, you had lost a collectible aspect of Magic where your opponent could just be playing anything. The experience had homogenized into something that was just not a good product for the average consumer, and the designers realized they had to do something.
Grand Prix Brussels 2004 winner, Tobi. Where did Affinity go from there?
One card earned a place on the ban list. I think even already a week later, Skullclamp was the first card that was banned.
It became the first card in years to be banned from Standard. And it's still banned in Modern and Legacy even today.
Great! Problem solved! People could finally rejoice that we wouldn't have any more of this.
If you didn't have 8 to 10 cards in your main deck specifically geared towards beating Affinity, you basically didn't stand a chance of beating it.
No one wants that. We're ready to step into a brand new world of Magic the Gathering with endless possibilities. Oh, but we're not done here. Arcbound Ravager had to learn to crab walk before he could crab run. Affinity came back for a part 3, baby.
Before long, Fifth Dawn, I think, added cranial plating.
One equipment out, another equipment in.
Affinity is dead. Long live Affinity! Cranial plating is a card they keep on having to ban. Even when this card is no longer legal, they had to ban its spiritual sister, All That Glitters, in Pauper. And then again, its demonic counterpart, Cranial Ram, in Pauper as well. If you just vomit your hand onto the battlefield, any tiny innocuous creature you have becomes the biggest thing on the battlefield.
Because cranial plating on any one of those creatures is lethal.
That was the time when people also learned that, oh, we should probably cast some other 0-mana artifact. Ornithopter.
And I'll make an aside for my favorite Ornithopter story. Richard Garfield had a meeting with a company about making another trading card game, and one of the executives said,
"Okay, but I just don't want you making anything that's broken."
Referring to this one absurdly powerful card they had made.
And Richard was trying to figure out what he was talking about, like Black Lotus, or what was he talking about? And the card he was talking about was Ornithopter.
And many people think that's funny because it's just a 0/2. But when your lands are free artifacts and you can play out your whole hand of 0-mana artifacts, cranial plating is just about as scary as a floating armored skull should be actually when you think about it. So when Grand Prix Zurich came along,
I stuck to my guns and registered a deck that was very similar to the deck I played at the Pro Tour, except with cranial plating instead of Skullclamp.
And Frank is famous for his no-nonsense mathematical approach to the game, so whilst other players bothered with colored spells like Somber Hoverguard and Shrapnel Blast,
I made sure to retain a high land count, as well as Ether Vial and Mere Retriever, favoring consistency and resiliency.
This madman even had 5 green lands in his sideboard for Oxidize and Viridian Shaman.
It worked perfectly for me at Grand Prix Zurich, and I made it all the way to the top 4.
Now this was a win for Frank Karsten and Affinity. He had solved the puzzle of how to optimize the deck, but this was not a win for the player base in general.
Won Grand Prix Orlando, it put 5 players in the top 8 of Grand Prix New Jersey, and it put 4 players in the top 8 of Grand Prix Rimini.
As the deck called either Vial Affinity or Karsten Affinity gained in popularity, it started invading the tournament scene like Potato Bugs infest a garden, except the Potato Bugs have spooky skull masks.
Affinity would still win 40 to 50% of its matches against the most hateful decks, and it would just crush anyone who was unprepared.
Affinity has been bashing decks that have 4 Oxidized and 4 Viridian Shaman for the last year or so.
It won Grand Prix Kuala Lumpur, it put 3 players in the top 8 of Grand Prix Nagoya, it was a prominent factor in various national championships, and it even put 3 players in the top 8 of the 2004 World Championships.
And this was not just extended. If you escape to Standard, you get slapped in the face by the same card pool.
If I recall correctly, there were like a lot of players who were genuinely tired of playing against the same deck over and over again.
So the Viral Vial deck was suffering from its success in a way that DJ Khaled could just never understand. Something had to be taken out of the deck to keep it in check, but what? Remember the color pie? If all the good cards you make are spread across 5 different colors, then different decks get to play different good cards. But if everyone can play all the best cards you printed, then everyone has this amorphous soup of a deck that's made from the same cards.
So much so that we had what we called the blob problem. The problem we had during the Mirrodin sort of era was that if we made a good card, and because it was an artifact themed set, and we wanted cards that were good, some of the cards we pushed were artifacts. And they ended up being really good, and then everybody had access to them.
So like in code, when you try to fix a line and 3 new errors pop up, or when you try to flatten a rug and it just curls up somewhere else, if you ban just one card, chopping off the Hydra's head, Affinity could just spawn 2 more heads that could neatly wear cranial plating.
In order to solve the problem, we ended up having to ban, I don't remember exactly, 8 cards or something. A lot of cards, a lot more than we had ever banned before.
An unprecedented 8-card ban.
They shot down Arcbound Ravager, buried all 6 artifact lands, and put Disciple of the Vault in a cardboard dungeon. Although by the looks of them, they liked it there.
Never before had so many cards been banned in Standard in a single announcement. And the same also happened to Block Constructed later. But yeah, one thing was for sure.
That was the end of Affinity.
If you were an Affinity aficionado like Frank, you had nowhere to play your favorite cards anymore. You could go to a casual free play event and proverbially dunk on some noobs with their life gain deck, but that just didn't pump the same kind of blood in your veins. Until
the brand new Modern format. In case you don't know what Modern is, it is basically every card set with the Modern card frame.
In 2011, the Modern format was created to replace Extended.
Modern was a promising place to play all your old broken cards. They did set some stoppers though. This new rule set would come with a rather sturdy ban list, including all the colored artifact lands and Skull Clamp. But would this be enough to keep the potato bugs with hell masks in check? It would have to compete with all the other absurd piles of cardboard that would be unleashed into this hellscape.
We immediately had a Pro Tour, the first Modern Pro Tour in Philadelphia, and there it was just a wild west of decks. Players were winning with turn 2 combos, they were ramping with 12 post, or they were attacking the format with decks like Splinter Twin, Zoo, or indeed Affinity.
But Affinity parachuted onto the ring with some wild new weapons. It could play Signal Pest, Vault Scourge, Springleaf Drum, and a Mox quite a bit more goosebump inducing than Chrome Mox, Mox Opal.
Mox Opal in particular was, well, effectively like a 5-color Mox because it was so easy to turn on Metalcraft.
Okay, we also made a Mox, because we never learned and we keep making Moxes. Metalcraft, tap, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. Activate this ability only if you control 3 or more artifacts.
The thing is, Mox Opal itself was an artifact, so kind of changed the Metalcraft text to you need 2 artifacts.
Mox Opal also saw a lot of play, so I think we keep making it slightly not as broken, but still over line was really powerful.
It's hard to make a fair Mox, so Affinity brandished it into battle at the first Modern Pro Tour, and
Shikara Nakajima made top 8 at that very first Modern Pro Tour with a red version of Affinity.
But the deck had lost its boots. Without the artifact lands, it couldn't leverage Frogmite, Mirror Enforcer, and the Disciple of the Vault ATOG package. Yet the deck didn't have its godfather around to help it. Frank was off studying game design in a way that I would imagine an upcoming kung fu prodigy in an isolated mountain with a one-eyed sensei would.
When I returned to the game a bit more seriously in 2013, after I finished my PhD thesis, I picked up Affinity for Modern and just never looked back.
And Frank's return as the deck's expert brought along a few changes. His understanding of how the deck was played in the old days brought him to optimize the strategy, and his gameplay videos and written deck guides garnered quite a following.
I cut a few of the colored spells because, well, you do need enough artifacts to turn on the synergies. I added a land, and I slotted in more big payoff cards like Steel Overseer and Master of Ethereum.
And it's wild because these fundamental changes he brought to the archetype were so key that his list from 2013 is almost the same as the lists that were played 6 years later.
For nearly a decade, Affinity was one of the pillars of the format. I myself got many deep finishes with the deck at a lot of Grand Prix and Pro Tour events.
But why was it not breaking the format the same way? I mean, it wasn't bad.
You know, there were some ebbs and flows, partly based on the number of Stony Silence, Shatterstorm, and other hate cards that were found in sideboards.
It wasn't just that the new version of the deck was hard to play unless you had mastered quick maths. It's also that without the artifact lands, cards that hose out artifacts were much more effective at beating the strategy. The old 6-pixel coverage days of Affinity still stomping anti-Affinity decks were now far behind.
And that
Oxidize the welding jar, bye-bye Glimmer Void.
That could be bye-bye game.
It's something interesting to talk about, which is that as powerful and explosive as the Affinity deck is, its best draws can be broken up with just 1 or 2 resistance spells. Sure. And you can see how different this game would be if one of those Ravagers had resolved.
It's a lot easier to go vampire hunting when armed with garlic and some steak. Hating out Affinity became such a meme that...
I remember when Modern Masters 2017 was previewed, I was offered the dubious honor of like having to preview the reprint of Stony Silence. Wizards of the Coast told me, well, you were the first person we thought of to show it. So I got to, well, show off the new art for the ultimate hate piece for my favorite deck.
The place of Affinity in Modern for the longest time was just that if you forgot about it, it crept up on you like untreated anxiety. Even at one of the scariest parts of Modern's history, the Eldrazi Winter, when no one could play anything but the Eldrazi Menace if they were ever hoping their opponent to extend a handshake, 6 of the top 8 decks were Eldrazi. Of course, it wouldn't be Christmas without Santa Claus, but the other 2 decks were Affinity because it was the only strategy that could talk back to the colorless tide.
You could actually outsize and outscale the Eldrazi decks. Sure, they have all of these like 2 mana lands, but well, we have Springleaf Drum and Moxen to keep up. It's a nice reality smasher you got, but my 6/6 artifact will happily block it.
But if while watching this video you're slowly adding Mox Opals and Arcbound Ravagers to your shopping cart, how do I tell you this?
Could we move on to the banning of Mox Opal?
Yeah, preferably not, but not a chance.
If you kick a bully in the shins often enough, they won't be able to walk fast enough to noogie you.
The death knell came on January 13 of 2020. For the sins of Urza, Lord High Artificer, Mox Opal was banned in Modern. And I quote, "As a source of fast mana in the early game, Mox Opal has long contributed to strategies that seek to end the game quickly and suddenly. As the strongest enabler in the recent Urza artifact decks, and a deck that has been concerning in the past and would likely cause balance issues in the future, Mox Opal is banned in Affinity." Now, sadly, Mox Opal, did I say Mox Opal is banned in Affinity?
Yeah. It shows how you feel about it.
New decks started to pop up and they snook into Affinity's toolbox and they did not use any of its favorite tools fairly. Mox Opal contributed to Affinity's most explosive draws, and without it, the Modern format just passed it by, waving from the window of its golden monster truck, blasting I Don't Want No Scrubs by TLC, despite being one of the longest lasting pillars of Modern.
Sadly, Mox Opal was the best card in Modern Affinity, and without either Mox Opal or the colored artifact lands, it couldn't really compete anymore.
The deck is now mostly defunct in Modern, but it still lives on in Pauper. The thing is, if you're a new player and you're constantly refreshing spoiler pages for new strategies, don't sleep on artifacts. Every once in a blood moon, the game designers try to toy with artifacts, and they're truly hard to balance.
Well, the thing is, the designers of Magic need to tread a very fine line here. It may never again be like you can cast a Thoughtcast on turn 1, a 5-mana spell, but something like that shows up time and again, and it should.
So Affinity is no longer hiding under your bed and pouncing out at every shadow, but it took a lot to finally trap it into the moon for good. Like Dio and JoJo's Bizarre Adventures, no matter how much of it you sliced off, it still kept coming back up for more. So is Affinity gone for good? We'll never really know. Subscribe to keep it in cardboard prison for another year. You don't know if I have that power or not, so why take the risk? If not, Affinity could come back and conquer Magic again. And I know one man in the Netherlands who's patiently waiting for that day.
I just wish that they had made an exception saying Mox Opal is banned, except if you play this exact Affinity deck from 2013 or something. Then,